Well, first of all, Maggie and I would like to invite you to welcome you to our Valentine's Day webinar. And we're going to look at a first date between Power BI and the SharePoint Framework. And what we'd like to do today is to start with we have a competition we've had at Critical Path Training, and different alumni sent in different surveys telling us what they've done and how many courses they've taken from us and kind of how it helped their career. So we went through quite a few finalists. We had about 100 different people that sent in things, and we picked 6 finalists, and those finalists were picked, so you had to have a certain amount of classes, and then we had to kind of see evidence that you've used it to really further your career. So the 6 finalists are Omar Stewart of GigWorks, Daniel Hahn, who's taken many courses from us from T-Mobile. We have Peter Brass from Kelly Dryer Warren. We have Dan Schultz from Beaumont Health. We have Philip Carson from Harvard University, and also Maria Alt, who just took the Power BI course with me just in the last year. Anyway, so what we'd like to do is have a drawing, and we've kind of advertised this as some type of a raffle. So since we have 6 contestants, what I was going to do is move over to everybody's favorite website, which is random.org, which then will give us a roll of a dice, and we'll basically come up with a random number. And notice it's not just randomness, but it's randomness with integrity, which is important. Let's go ahead. Are you laughing, Maggie? I'm being very serious here on Valentine's Day. I'm going to click roll the dice. We have a number 6, and Maria Alt is our winner inside there. What do you have to say about that, Maggie?
Oh my gosh, Maria, I'm so excited for you. I'm going to go ahead and reach out to you if you're not here today, no problem. Thank you everyone for submitting all those great responses, and we really appreciate your support and hope you enjoyed the webinar today.
Well, thank you, Maggie. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into our session for today. So we're going to start with a little bit on the SharePoint Framework, your new SharePoint development platform. Now, there is, I think, a lot more information out there on the SharePoint Framework than there is on Power BI Embedded, so I'm going to tilt a little bit of the conversation to the developer details of Power BI and report embedding. We'll talk about programming with the Power BI REST API. We got to get started with Power BI Embedded, which is going to take us into Azure, and basically we're going to have to create Power BI Embedded workspace collections in our Azure subscription, and then there's a bunch of things you have to do to upload your reports. We're also going to talk about working with DirectQuery mode, in which you have a report, and your report is being served out of the Power BI cloud, yet every time someone looks at the report or clicks on a slicer, it does another direct query, right to the underlying database, so you kind of get real-time data. And we'll talk about what we can do and what are the limitations of working with direct query mode. And then finally, we'll put it all together and put it into a SharePoint Framework web part. Okay, well, let's start talking about why are we starting to get excited about the SharePoint Framework. Well, we had Farm Solutions, and Farm Solutions served us well for about a decade. Microsoft tried to replace Farm Solutions with Sandbox Solutions. That didn't work out very well. So then they introduced the SharePoint app model. And as we know, a couple years later, the marketing people switched the SharePoint app model to the SharePoint add-ins model. And it gives us a way to write code or a software-based solution that works across the SharePoint on-premises to SharePoint Online divide. However, working with SharePoint add-ins, you have this 2-domain complexity, this dichotomy of knowing when your code is executing in the app web and whether you want to execute against the app web or the host web, and it gets to be very confusing. Now, what many people have done is gone to a JavaScript injection solution. You have much of the same work that you write the client-side JavaScript code as you would in the SharePoint app model. It's just that we directly copy our files into a SharePoint site, so you get rid of the complexity of 2 domains, and you basically can create great solutions for things like customizing the forms for data entry in a SharePoint list. The problem with JavaScript injection, there's two problems. One is that there's no formal deployment model. And two, more and more, Microsoft is disabling the ability to run scripting on SharePoint sites up in SharePoint Online. Okay, so the answer now gets to the SharePoint Framework. The SharePoint Framework I really see as, taking the JavaScript injection model, seeing that developers really like getting rid of the complexity of the two domains, but now giving us a formal deployment path to basically create a software-based solution and push it out. Now, when we start working with the SharePoint Framework, it's client-side development based on TypeScript. In theory, you don't have to learn TypeScript to work with SharePoint Framework, but in practice, you absolutely do because all the demos and all the tools are based on it. But the idea is that our code is going to run with the identity of the current user, and we can just directly make calls into things like the SharePoint REST API, and we don't have to worry about authentication because everything's happening behind the scenes. Just like security was happening behind the scenes in a SharePoint hosted app. However, now you can just call directly into the SharePoint REST API and not worrying about redirecting from the app web to the host web. Things are going to be far more straight ahead. Okay, now one challenge for a lot of us is that we've gotten very used to Visual Studio. So this new development model is based on cross-platform development tools. And if you haven't seen any of the SharePoint Framework webinars or demos that people at Microsoft and other people are putting out there, it's a big change. Okay, now another big thing about the SharePoint Framework is it's following the migration of the SharePoint Online user interface from the older UI to this new experience, which is really targeting mobile devices. So everything we can do for the SharePoint Framework, is going to be optimized pretty much by default for a mobile device. Now, let's say we start working with the SharePoint Framework. You might create a client-side web part. Remember, you're going to be programming in TypeScript. If you haven't learned it, it's a new learning curve. Maybe you like to use React as your JavaScript library. Maybe you want to program against the SharePoint REST API. One of the nice things about working with the SharePoint Framework is that, well, I'm going to program in TypeScript, but maybe I'll use Angular. I can use Angular 1, 1.5, 2.0. And then once I decide, what the underlying framework is going to be, what do I want to do? I want to call into the Power BI REST API to start doing some work. Now, a couple things about the SharePoint Framework. So no more iframes, which means things are more straight ahead. The code runs with the identity and the permissions of the current user. So in some ways, the SharePoint add-in model added this extra security layer so that your code wasn't as powerful as the current user and your app had to acquire permissions. So with the SharePoint Framework, we basically decided that that extra security layer isn't worth the complexity. So the idea is your code basically just runs as the current user, and when your code calls into the SharePoint REST API to create a new list or to add a list item, it basically just does so with the user permissions, and it all works out very easily if all you really want to do is write to one of the SharePoint APIs, like the SharePoint REST API or the client-side object model. Now, another thing that we're going to see is the SharePoint Framework gives us this web part model that supports various DOM lifecycle events. So you'll be called when it's time to render, but if you want to tap into things like the load event or when the web part serializes or deserializes the property values, there are ways that you can tap into those things. As I mentioned, you can use whatever JavaScript framework that you want. Now, one thing I have to point out is that you can easily program against SharePoint content because you're running in the context of a SharePoint site, and so it kind of recognizes you, as that user in that SharePoint site. So when you do things, such as write against the SharePoint REST API, security is transparent. However, we're going to want to call to other resources that use OAuth 2. For instance, I might want to call into the Graph, the Microsoft Graph API, as the current user, or I want to call into the Power BI REST API as the current user. So this is something where you can use things like the Active Directory authentication library for JavaScript. Other people have been doing samples using hello.js. So somehow you have to get an access token for another OAuth 2 secured resource, and that's something that they're working on, just baking something into the SharePoint framework that would be, something that would serve the purpose of adl.js as far as being able to authenticate. So when that gets here, we'll really be able to do some neat things. And I'll kind of point out at the end, what things you could do today and what things we're kind of waiting on this new authentication mechanism. Now, let me quickly kind of go through the cross-platform toolchain. We'll have to work with things like Node.js, Node Package Manager. Now, let me get through a couple. There's a couple slides here I don't think we should take time to work through. But the idea is that you're going to install Node.js, which automatically installs Node Package Manager. If you go to the GitHub repository for the SharePoint framework, they have the kind of the instructions to step through and install the Windows build tools on a Windows machine, install cross-platform utilities like Gulp and Yeoman, and then we're going to be basically creating projects by running a Yeoman template for the SharePoint framework that was created by a team who's developing the SharePoint framework. Okay, now the idea is we work at a command prompt, whether it's the PowerShell command prompt, whether it is the one that's installed with Git, whether you use Commander or anything else, you're basically calling command line commands. So as we go through and we create these particular solutions, and I'm going to open one up in just a second, you basically have Node Package Manager packages. And if you haven't worked with this environment before, this is not the webinar where I'm going to go into those details, but it certainly is a big change. Now, I'm going to go ahead and demo something. So let's say that I have this one particular project. I just want to show the Hello World web part, how we start working with web part properties. So instead of using Visual Studio, we're going to use Visual Studio Code. And so I'm going to open up this project and kind of look at the Hello World web part here. So once again, this is TypeScript. And as you work with TypeScript, it's a language that sits on top of JavaScript and gives us an object-oriented programming model, much like C# or Java. And it gives us strongly typed libraries when we program against things like Angular and other JavaScript libraries. Now, here's this greeter web part right here. Now, once you create a particular project and you open it up, what I want to do is kind of show you a very simple web part that has a set of properties. So here's the greeter web part. It's got a greeting as a string. It's got a large font and a color. And note that I've defined an interface with these particular properties. Now back over here, in this other source file for the greeter web part, we have a base client-side web part, and we take that interface that defines the three properties for our web part, and we basically feed it as a parameter to our base class, base client-side web part. Now, I've added these three different properties. And so notice that inside your web part base class, you can now say properties dot and refer to those particular properties inside there. Now, also, when you start working with the SharePoint framework, every web part is going to have a manifest. So notice that here in the manifest, I can take things like the greeting property, large font, and the color property, and I can basically give them values that are initialized. Now, here's the part where we start calling gulp commands. So gulp is a scripting environment. Takes some time to get used to, but the idea is that when we program and we start developing SharePoint framework projects, you create projects that already have gulp commands, and the one that the SharePoint framework team decided to give us for running the debugger is gulp serve. So we'll go ahead and run gulp serve right here. And the idea is that this takes all parts of this SharePoint framework project, and it does things like it takes CSS files, stylistically awesome style sheets, and basically builds them into CSS files. It takes your TypeScript, builds it into JavaScript and whatnot. Okay, but the idea is it's able to put everything together. Now, what I wanted to show here is just the new properties pane. So notice that I have my web part. Let's go back, take a look at this inside, and let's go back and look at the web part class itself. So notice that we have a render method. And with that render method, it runs every time a property changes. Now, we also have this protected get property pane configuration. So that's the thing that allows us, if I click on this right here, to basically make some changes right here. You know, let's say that our greeter defects from Walmart to Contoso, and you know, you can see that as I type on the right, it's mirrored automatically by the left inside there. So the way things work out is that you build a property panel configuration that has input controls. For instance, here's a property pane text field. Here's the property pane toggle, the property pane drop down. So the idea is that you're able to provide this user interaction inside here, and as users are making changes to these properties down here, what you're going to find is every single time a property changes, render fires, and I'm just calling this.properties.greeting to basically put something inside there, and you can see if I change something like my font size, the render method just has code to look at properties large font, and if it's large, make it 60px. If it's not, make it 32. You know, so this is kind of low tech, but just giving you the idea of, you know, how these web parts are going to look. Now, note that you can work with the local workbench. Let me also show you that I'm going to go into a SharePoint site. So here's my SharePoint Online site, and if inside of a SharePoint site you go to underscore layouts, and right afterwards you type workbench.aspx, you know, what you can see here is that, you know, you can basically get things working inside here. And now I can go ahead and add that. Now, I'm not going to take you through all the steps, but what's possible for you to do is to take everything in your SharePoint web part package, and you can package it up as a web app package. And so let me go back here to my SharePoint site, and let me duplicate that tab. So what I want to do is I want to show that with a SharePoint web part, and you've got it in a SharePoint Framework style package, what you're able to do is to install it in the regular app catalog. You know, for instance, if I go click on apps in this tenancy that I have up in the cloud, and then we go to app catalog right here, and we go look at our apps for SharePoint, you know, you're going to see that I have this Walmart greeter, and the idea is that you put it into a package that ultimately just has one .js file and one JSON file, and then you basically push those up to a CDN, and then you build a package that points to them. And then once you install the package, it starts working just like a SharePoint add-in. And that is, let's go back to our site, and if I look at site contents, you know, one of the things that you could see is I've already installed that SharePoint solution inside there. Now, the reason I wanted to do this demo is let's see what the new web parts look like in the old UI. So if I go to Edit Page, and here's just a regular SharePoint wiki page, you know, so this is the old SharePoint UI, and we're not going to pick on app parts, we're going to pick on web parts, and then if I go down here, there is the greeter web part inside there. I can now go add that to SharePoint pages inside here. Now, if I go ahead and click and save, you know, there's some kind of strange stuff in the fact that the new web part model doesn't really have the Chrome like the old web part model does. But let me go down here and go to Edit Page. Let's look at the new web part in the old task pane. So we'll go to Edit Web Part inside there. And notice that you have this configure button. I'll click on that in just a second. But since it's the old web part, I can do something such as, take the Chrome type and switch it to none. And, now that we have done that, and now this goes away, now you are going to see that we've gotten rid of the Chrome. But finally, here's the last thing I'll demo here, is that if we go back to our new SharePoint Framework web part, we go into Edit and click on Configure. Oh, for some reason it's not giving me that UI inside there. Let's try if I can refresh one more time. And if I click on this right here, now you can kind of see that, still in the old UI, you can still get to the new property pane inside there. Okay, so there was a lot of work just to kind of get up and going with the SharePoint framework. And so learning things like, how to use gulp to do things like build your project and run the debugger, and then how to build web parts. And I kind of showed you a quick example of creating the interface, including that interface when you define the base class for your web part class, and then basically adding in the property pane settings page, allows you to build out that user interface. Okay, now let's switch gears and talk a little bit about programming with Power BI. Now, with Power BI, let's kind of start with the non-developer, kind of the low-hanging fruit. So there is this URL that we can go to, which is app.powerbi.com. And if we go to a particular site like this, you can see that, we have different things as far as dashboards and reports. Now, let's look at this one particular report right here that I've created. Now, one part about Power BI is that we have consumers, the people looking at the reports. We have the report builders, and they're the people who are going to be using a tool called Power BI Desktop. Now, Power BI Desktop is a great tool. I'm afraid to open it in a demo because it will start sucking up time. We want to kind of talk about development matters. So I just decided to kind of put some things in the slides here. Now, when you start working with Power BI Desktop, what you're able to do is create a new project, and every single project that you're going to create is a PBIX file. But the idea is Power BI Desktop allows you to find queries, so you can do your ETL, your extract, transform, load. You can do data modeling with a language called DAX, so you can write calculated columns and measures, and then you're able to design reports. Okay. Now, at the end of the day, you have a PBIX file. Okay, now, I told you I wasn't going to open this up, but let me just go ahead and kind of show you the PBIX files that I'm going to be using in this demo. So if I go to Demos, and I have a couple of PBIX files here. Let's open this one, which is called Northwind Retrospective, or Northwind Retro. So the idea, of this tool is that it's for power users or data professionals, and they're able to design a set of queries. And the idea is that they build queries with a set of tools that used to go by the name of Power Query, and then now they just go by the name of the query features of Power BI Desktop. But the idea is you write queries, and behind the queries, they're writing code in this language which is called M. The letter M is the name of the programming language. And some people like to write code in M. Other people like to work in this designer. But the idea is that, once you've created these particular queries, you run them, and it basically drops a stock set of data into your particular project. Now, once you get the data inside of your project, you can start doing things, such as adding calculate columns and measures inside there, and then you're going to build out a report. Now, each PBIX project has a single report, but your report can have many pages inside there. Also note that the data, in most cases, is going to be sucked into the project. You're working in import mode, And so you have a copy of the data behind the project, and then you're going to publish the project, and publishing the project basically pushes it up into the cloud. So if I go ahead and I publish this particular project right here, you already have a data set of this particular name. Would you like to override it? I'll say fine. Okay, so I think that's enough of Power BI Desktop. Now that we've pushed things up there, the idea is that users can come back here and open one of these particular reports, and the idea is that now the consumer is able to use what the report builder has done. Okay, great stuff. If you're working as a developer, you might be the one who's using Power BI Desktop, but I also see something that's going to be very common, and that is that someone who's building the reports is not the developer who's packaging up the application that's going to host those reports. So you also might be using something like the Power BI REST API, and you might be working with another professional who's creating the PBIX files and then handing the PBIX files to you to publish. Okay. Now, we've looked at that one particular demo, NorthwindRetro.pbix. Now, what we want to focus on is how to embed reports in external applications. Whether it's a single page application you're creating with Angular, or it's a server-side MVC application, or it's a SharePoint Framework web part. The idea is that you're embedding with iframes. Okay, now the good news is I told you that as you move from the SharePoint app model to the SharePoint Framework, we got rid of the iframes. That's great. Now I'm bringing an iframe back in, but what you'll find is that there's not as much that you have to do to communicate back and forth. So to me, the iframe model works very well for embedding reports inside there. Now, let's go ahead and look at our first demo. So the first demo, I'm going to go back here and I'm going to open up. And this one is going to be a fairly simple, we're not going to add TypeScript in yet. And this one is the Power BI Content Viewer. So here's an example of using the Angular framework, so there's just Angular 1, and using the Active Directory Authentication Library. So let me go ahead and run this first. And so using the Active Directory Authentication Library for JavaScript, allows us to provide this experience where a user just go to the page, the user has not logged in. We're going to go ahead and log this user in. And as that user logs in, we're going to then give the user the ability to pull down reports. Okay, so let's go ahead and log in here. Okay, now since we've logged in, I'm going to go ahead and pull up Fiddler so you can get an idea of how this REST API works. I want to get reports back. So basically this is going to pull back a set of reports, taking a set to load that in. As it comes back here, what you're going to see here, once this loads in, and let me make this a little bit bigger. Okay, so what we have here is when I want to get the reports back, you can see that there is this /beta my.org reports. Okay, some of the things I'm using are still under the beta endpoint. There is a V1.0 endpoint, but the beta has newer stuff inside there. So now if I go to inspectors and we look at the JSON result that comes back inside here, what you can see is that it gives me back for each report the ID. So every report is identified by a GUID. It's got its name. It's got basically an embed URL and a web URL. Now, if I point you to the web URL I can just give to some user who can then access it. But the idea of the embed URL is that it's going to go inside of an iframe. Now, let's go back here and look at something like, the Northwind Retro inside there. So here we are bringing up, this particular report inside of my custom application. And once again, all I'm really doing as a developer is figuring out how to host this. Meanwhile, all the querying and all the data modeling, all the report design is basically just in a black box as a PBIX file that I'm bringing inside there. Now, the way that this is going to work is that we have to figure out how to create the iframe. Now, I created this demo about a year ago before Microsoft introduced a Power BI JavaScript library, and I'm going to show that code in my second demo. But in this first demo, what's kind of difficult is that we had to build this by creating a custom directive, and the idea is you can't just create an iframe, but the iframe then has to have an event handler on its load event. So you basically had to create these. Let me go back here and kind of show the reports view inside here. So here we create an iframe, and then we say iframe on load. And in short, what you really need to do is somehow inject an access token that you've gotten inside there. Now, the second demo I'm going to show you, there's a new Microsoft-provided JavaScript library from the Power BI team that makes all this go away. Okay, now let's go a little bit further here. You kind of saw the idea that you can host reports, inside of an application. And in Power BI, everybody's got a personal workspace. So you can simply have people authenticate, and once you know who they are, you can basically start bringing back reports from their personal workspace. So now we want to look at something else, which is called Power BI Embedded. Now, Power BI Embedded is an Azure service. And the idea is that we can create one of these Power BI embedded services on demand in my Azure subscription. Now, when we create one, we're going to create what's called a workspace collection. And that's going to be named. And then you're going to create workspaces inside there. Now, there's really no way to do any of this through the UI of Azure at this point. So what we're going to find is that we need to either write PowerShell or C# code to do that for it. Now, why should you care about Power BI Embedded? If you're not using Power BI Embedded, you're just using PowerBI.com, well then every single user has to have a Power BI license. So Power BI Embedded is really when you want to not have any of the users require Power BI licensing or possibly even require Office 365 licensing. So the idea is that in Azure we provision a service, and then we have a way to pass a key back and forth. So the application authenticates, but the users don't authenticate with the system. And then they have a notion of a report session where you pay something like 5 cents, per report session. And a report session could last up to an hour. So we're not going to be using lots of report sessions just for a single user who's interacting with a report. Now, when you use Power BI and you're thinking of embedded reports, Microsoft will talk about PowerBI.com versus Power BI Embedded. So remember that PowerBI.com is where the user authenticates with an Office 365 account, and that user requires the Power BI license, either the free license or the Power BI Pro $10 a month license. With Power BI Embedded, you basically stand up your website wherever you want, or you use it in something like the SharePoint Framework. Okay, one requires Office 365 accounts, the other doesn't. One requires Power BI licenses for users, the other doesn't. But PowerBI.com, you can basically get everything rolling without any custom development. But with Power BI Embedded, you have to do development to stand things up. Okay, so with PowerBI.com, you don't need the Azure subscription. With Power BI Embedded, you do. Now, here's the big picture for Power BI Embedded. We're going to have someone who is basically going to take the lead on creating the PBIX project file. And the idea is you install Power BI Desktop. Power BI Desktop only runs on Windows. So if you're a cross-platform person, you can't be cross-platform for this one particular task. Okay, once we've gotten the PBIX files, Then we're going to provision Azure resources for Power BI Embedded. And we're going to create a Power BI workspace collection, and we're going to create Power BI workspaces. And inside those workspaces, we're going to do something to upload the PBIX files. Okay, and then finally, you're going to develop some type of a web front end to basically embed reports inside there. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. Let's go ahead and I'm going to shut off Fiddler over here. I'm going to move back and we're going to move to the Azure portal. And as I get to the Azure portal, I want to look at all resources. And what you can see here is that we've got a couple with the Power BI icon. So if I say add, and now I say Power BI, just to see what type of Power BI things they have inside there, they have Power BI embedded. Now, I've already created one of these services inside here. So let's go back and take a longer look at that. So notice that when you have a particular Power BI service that you've created, it's what we call a workspace collection, and you have to give it a unique name. So I've taken CPT-demo. No one else can use that. It's just kind of like creating something with AzureWebsites.net, where you pick a domain, the domain has to be free, and then it's yours. Okay, now what's tricky is I can get up to this point through this user interface, but when you want to start creating workspaces, that's where you have to start running code inside there. So let's go ahead and look at some code that I have here. What I have here is something that is going to create a new particular workspace inside there. Now, as far as this project goes, let me go to Manage NuGet Packages and just kind of show you the different packages. So there is a Microsoft.Power BI API and a Microsoft.Power BI core. So these are packages with .NET assemblies, and all this code I've just basically written, inside of a console application. But you could also write the exact same code in PowerShell or in C# code that ran on the server. Okay, now what this code is going to do inside there is do things like get a resource group and create a resource group if it hasn't been created, and then get the workspace collection names inside there. Now, let me go ahead and run this project inside here. I'm going to go run this project, and one of the things that you have to do is you have to create a new workspace within the workspace collection. And once again, that's either PowerShell or C#. And once you create the workspace collection, you really don't have anything but a GUID that you can use. Now, once you have that, let's go look at some of this code down here. For instance, if I go look at the code that is going to allow me to start programming against this, there's something which is called a Power BI client. And the idea is that this kind of gives you a client proxy object to program against. And when you start programming against that, one of the things that you're going to need, is a key. So if I go back here and we now kind of look at this, note that when you've created one of these, you're not going to authenticate users and be passing a access token that's user specific. Instead, you're going to use these access keys, and I can simply copy them and paste them into my code. Note that if you log in with your developer credentials into your subscription, you can also pull this key back programmatically, and that's one of the things that this client application does. Now, you want to create a workspace. So you can see that if I say client.workspaces, and notice that when you create this Power BI client, it is going to be specific to a workspace collection. So there is a post workspace async. Now, the other things we have to start doing is uploading PBIX files. And so here's just an example of creating a PBI client and then saying client.imports post-import file async. And the idea is that you're then able to upload your particular files that are PBIX files inside there. Okay, now if I go down here and I kind of take a look at what my application spit out right here. So here is a bunch of details about the things that I have uploaded inside there. Now, once I've gone through and I've done my importing, I'm going to go down here to list reports. So basically, I've uploaded 3 PBIX files inside there. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and look at each of these, and I'm going to spit out the report name, the embed URL, and then I also want to get an embed access token. So there is something that I can do to get the embed access token for the reports. Now, let me jump down to the bottom just to kind of show you this code. So the server-side API has a Power BI token. And the idea is that I'm going to create a report embed token. And note that when I do that, I basically give it the workspace collection, workspace ID, the report ID. Also, the access token by default is going to last an hour, a little over an hour. But you can basically say, I want this refresh token to last for a whole day, 24 hours inside there. Okay. Then you have to put this claim. The type is going to be an embed. And then once you've got that, you're going to call embed token generate. Okay, and that gives you these particular tokens inside there. Now, once you've got that, you're going to be able to run a particular report. Okay, I'm going to open up another project here. And this one is the Power BI report embedded viewer. So let's go ahead and open this up. And one of the things that this is going to do is it has information about those particular keys inside there. You know, so here's something that we could either have the access keys put inside there. Okay. And once again, you know, remember that this is not your access token as a developer. You know, this is the access token to that one particular resource, which is the Power BI embedded workspace collection. And also, I'm putting this in the web.config file, so it's kind of a server side. It's a confidential client that can hold this particular secret. Okay, and then you specify the workspace collection and the workspace ID. Now, let's go ahead and run this right here. So with this particular demo, I have an application that kind of shows what's possible inside here. You know, so what we're trying to do is build out this user view. So the idea is that the user can now pick a particular report, and now the report is going to load inside there. Now, when the report loads inside there, that's interesting. Okay, let's go back and take a look at something about this particular project. And so what I want to look at here is, let's go in my project and look at the app.js file. Okay, now here we're using this special library which is called powerbi.js. Now what's really neat about this is that when it's time for you to embed a report, what you're able to do is say Power BI embed. You basically point to a report container, which is basically going to be nothing more than a HTML element. And once you've done that, I can say report config, here's 2 different settings. And the idea is it creates the iframe for you inside here. Now, going a little bit further, you know, let's say that, let me go into full screen on this. Let's say, do I want to show navigation? So notice that you can have basically the standard view that a user would have in the Power BI service where they show the report pages in the tab, but you can also choose to remove that and have your own page navigation. Notice that you can also show or hide the filter pane over on the very right. You know, do you want users to be able to come in here and be able to change your filtering, or do you want to just hide the filter pane from them? Okay. Now, as I go back and I step through some of this code inside here, you know, what you're going to see is that you're going to create this new report. And once again, this is using the Power BI client. It's their JavaScript API. So when you create this object, it wraps the iframe. But then you can say report.on, and you could basically start handling events, such as when the iframe in the report finishes loading. And then I'm going to be able to reach in there and get the pages. And so one of the things that we've done here is kind of showed an example of how you can kind of fill up the report pages so that you can create a much slicker user interface experience. You know, once again, without doing this, I could simply show navigation. But you know what you'll find is that, you know, if you have a lot of pages, or for various reasons sometimes you can't see anything, you know, you might find just hiding the navigation and building your own reporting infrastructure down here, you know, where users can kind of move from page to page inside there, you know, might be, you know, a better user interface experience inside there. Okay, so what we've seen right here, you know, is basically working with the Power BI JavaScript API, what's also called the Power BI client. Now, another thing that, let me keep moving here. Here's an example of creating a workspace collection with the Azure commandlets that the Power BI team has added. Get Azure RM Power BI Workspace Collection, and then once you've done that, you can start creating workspaces inside there. You know, here's also an example of importing a PBX file into a particular workspace. Once you've created the workspace inside there, you can basically use this utility. So some of the things that you do are using these Azure commandlets, like Azure Power BI Workspace. But note that once you get into the fine detail, there is a particular command line utility called Power BI, CLI. So you have to install that. Then your PowerShell can drive the import process through that. And you can also create the embed tokens inside there. Or you can do it like I'm doing it in a C# style console application. Okay. We also showed that I can do things, you know, such as once the report loads, I can bind JavaScript event handlers in the host page that's embedding that iframe with the report, so that I can have code that fires when the report's loaded, and I can pull out the pages and fill my own navigation infrastructure. And then as users change from page to page, you know, we can also track that inside there. Okay. Now, another thing we might do is work with datasets in DirectQuery mode. Now, to do that, let me go ahead and look at a different PBIX project. Now, I'm going to open up this project right here, which is Wingtip Sales, but this one is in DirectQuery mode. And the idea of DirectQuery mode is that your project is not importing data. Every time we need data, we're going to the data source. You know, so as I open this, it's kind of making me validate the connection inside there. But what you're going to see is that when you work in DirectQuery mode, let's go back and look at my queries right here. You know, what you're going to see is that they're only a source. So when you use DirectQuery mode, I'm basically doing direct queries right against a SQL Azure database inside there. So when you're working in this DirectQuery mode, you'll find that you can't do much in the query other than return a SQL statement. So the idea is the database has to do all the work. Now, once the data comes back, what you're going to, or once you, have defined the data sources, let's go kind of take a look at relationship mode. You still have to kind of define the relationship between those. Okay, and then as you start, working with the report inside here, you're going to see that every time, someone clicks on a slicer, it's actually issuing another SQL statement inside there. Now, what's tricky about this one is that there's no imported data, so the only way it could get the data is basically for you to configure data source credentials. Now, to give you an idea, let's go back here, and I have two different data sources. Well, one is an imported data source. So if I go to this data source and I go to its report, even if Power BI doesn't have the credentials, it can still use the imported data. And if we don't have the credentials, we just can't refresh the data, but still things work. When you go to DirectQuery, on the other hand, nothing works unless you edit the credentials. So if I go down here to Data Settings, and now I go to Data Source Credentials, basically we could set those inside there, inside the service. And now the idea is that, every time you're clicking on something right here, let's go ahead and start, looking at 2012 and looking at females in 2012. And the idea is that every time I click on a slicer, it's basically running queries, directly against that underlying SQL database. Okay. Now, to deal with that, when you have Power BI embedded and you can't just go into a UI like I just did and configure credentials, you have to basically work it into your code. So coming back here, let's take a look at if I want to update the credentials for this thing inside there. I'm first of all going to upload the PBIX file, so you have an import. Once you've done that, you're going to get the data set from that, and then once you've got the data set, there's a way to say client.datasets get gateway data sources async, and now what you're able to do is to call this client.gateways patch data source async, and what you're really trying to do, is pass the basic credentials inside there, a username and a password. And so once you've been through, all those elements inside there, let's go back to our Power BI viewer application. What we're going to see is that now we've got a DirectQuery. And if I come back here, let's look at DirectQuery. And the only way this is working, is that when you uploaded that PBIX file, you were able to go back and through PowerShell or your C# code, you're able to kind of inject those credentials. So once again, now I just have a custom application, and I click on this, and it sends a request back to the Power BI Cloud. The Power BI Cloud then queries the database, brings back data, basically builds the data set on the fly, builds a report page, and sends it back to me. Okay, so there's a lot of moving pieces right there. Now, you can choose between imported and DirectQuery mode data sets. So data is imported into the Power BI Cloud when you have the imported model, and you max out at 1 gigabyte, and you can refresh the data, but your data is only as fresh as the last refresh time. Okay, now when you use the DirectQuery model, you're basically just issuing raw SQL queries every time we need to get new data. So you don't need to worry about refreshing the data. It's a non-issue. You don't have to worry about the 1 gigabyte size that you can't go over in import mode. However, there's a bunch of limitations that are placed on Power BI desktop design. Now, first of all, what type of data sources support DirectQuery? And you'll find it's pretty much SQL-based databases and nothing like SharePoint Online. But what you'll find is that when you use DirectQuery mode, all the tables have to come from a single database, so you can't span multiple databases. Many things that you can do in queries are not allowed. You can't create calculated columns. You have limitations on the DAX code you can write in measures. But once again, if you're trying to create a real-time system where you need to look up, and if something was added to the database 30 seconds ago, your user needs to see that. It could be the best way to be able to get there. Okay, now let's put all this together. So let's go ahead and what I want to do here is let's go back, and I have one more particular project. And our particular project here is going to be one called Simple Simon. And so what I wanted to show here is I've got a web part, and so one of the things that I've added into this particular project, if I go back to my packin.json file, we have the Power BI client inside here. So once again, Power BI client is a JavaScript library. Now, when I go back here and I take a look at my web part itself, up here, if we say import star as PBI from Power BI client, and now that we've done that, we're going to create an embed configuration. Now here's an access token. Take that this is really more of a proof of concept than a real shipping application. You'd have better ways to kind of get an access token and put it inside there, whether it's a server-side piece, and I'll come back to that in just a second. But the idea is that we have an embed URL, we have a report ID, we have an access token. Now here, I can call PBI service. There's kind of a way that we can create this Power BI client, and then we say Power BI embed inside there. If I want, I can take it into full screen. Let's not go ahead and do that right now, but with this, let's now go back, and that's the wrong file, or the wrong window. This is the right window right here. Okay, so let's go ahead and do a gulp serve. And as we run this particular gulp serve right here, what we should be doing is basically starting up our particular web part, and it should be embedding that Power BI report from the Power BI embedded service, inside of our particular web part right here. Okay, we'll give this another second or two to start up. And as this starts up, now all we're really doing is embedding the report, but that's going to create the iframe and give us a starting point inside there. Okay, so you can see with only about 10 lines of code, we'll go ahead, we'll call hello world, and then all of a sudden, we have our report showing up inside here. Now at this point, I didn't do anything to get rid of. If I wanted to get rid of the page tiles down below, and I wanted to replace them with my own custom navigation, that would be something that we could do inside there. But the idea here is that we're able to instantly provide views into our reports with these PBIX files, and the PBIX files are definitely what is strategic to Microsoft moving forward. And so to take the natural progression of moving to the SharePoint framework to build the new presentation layer in a SharePoint site, and then to host PBIX files, whether they're going to be a PBIX file that's in PowerBI.com. So for instance, one choice you would have is hosting a PBIX file that is in that user's personal workspace or a group workspace that user is in. And in that case, the user is going to already have an Office 365/SharePoint license, but the user is then going to need to have a Power BI license, which could be the free Power BI license or the $10 a month license. The other alternative is to use Power BI Embedded, where then you're hosting reports and you're paying on the report session. You're not paying via user licenses for the Power BI service inside there. So one of the things that we really need to do, is to have some easy way that I can call into the Power BI REST API and authenticate, which means we have to be able to get an access token for this one particular OAuth 2 resource, which is the Power BI REST API for that particular user. So as I mentioned, the SharePoint Framework team has had several comments, saying we have something that's coming soon, and I'm certainly hoping that that is something that will be there, when we hit general availability with the SharePoint Framework. Okay, a couple other things to note is that when you're working with Power BI Embedded, you upload a PBIX file. So sometimes they call that an import, sometimes they call it a data set, sometimes they call it a report. There's actually 3 different collections of imports, data sets, and reports, but every time you upload a PBIX file, you have one entry in the import, data set, and report. So when you upload a PBIX file, it's all of those things. Okay, here's a little bit of code to kind of show direct connect. We talked about, putting everything together there and different things that we can do. One quick little call out, since we're kind of getting toward the end here, is that we have some developer training for Power BI. We have a Power BI bootcamp for professional developers. If you want to learn more about creating custom visuals with TypeScript and D3 and working with R and integrating R scripts into the Power BI environment, we teach that. We also teach the Power BI REST API and Power BI Embedded. If, on the other hand, you want to get up to speed on Power BI Desktop and get good at creating PBIX files, then we have the Power BI Bootcamp that doesn't have developer in its title. So the audience is data professionals, business analysts, business users. So lots of good hands-on of basically building Power BI Desktop projects inside there. Okay, so with that, hopefully you've learned something about Power BI and the SharePoint Framework. Hopefully I've kind of motivated how the two might have a good relationship, one being Microsoft's strategic reporting layer, the other being Microsoft's new strategic presentation layer development platform for the SharePoint Online framework. Okay. So with that, I think what I'll do is I'm going to turn over to questions. I'm just going to look at the question and answer panel that we have here. Okay, so my friend Brian Goff says Happy Valentine's Day. Thank you, Brian. Brian was in my class a week or two ago. We're platonic. He would have wished me a good day no matter what day it was today. Okay. Here's a good question by Matt Engel, came in quite a ways ago. What if your code needs a higher level of permissions than the current user? So as we mentioned, SharePoint Framework runs as the current user, so there really is no elevation technique. With the good and simple comes the bad, the inflexibility. Okay, how does this compare to the new Power BI report web part for SharePoint Online? Basically, it's the same style of code inside there. They have code that works through the authentication inside there. But the idea is that if you, create your own web part, you'll have more flexibility in how you want to present the UI, and maybe more flexibility in how you want to use Power BI options that are exposed to you. Okay. Are there options to embed, into SharePoint 2013? And yes, you can embed in the SharePoint add-in model. You can obviously embed in the classic web part model. So there's nothing about the SharePoint framework that has a monopoly on being able to embed Power BI reports. You just basically, have to learn the basics of, managing the PBIX files, uploading them, and then basically, if you are using server-side code, there is quite a few .NET helper assemblies, and then one for MVC as well. If you're writing only client-side code, you're going to use the Power BI client, which is pretty much the Power BI JavaScript API, and then you're going to have to do things like make your own REST calls into the Power BI REST API, to get things like the report collections back. So for each report, you can get its identifying GUID and the embed URL inside there. Okay, another question, can SPFx be used on-premise, and is there a way to integrate Power BI with an on-premise installation? So as far as SharePoint Framework on-premise goes, Microsoft certainly has messages, that we will support this. I would approach that with a healthy sense of skepticism, making them ship something, prove it works, before you're going to start telling people you can do this. So, one of the things I think is that how long will it take? So quite often if Microsoft pushes something out to SharePoint Online and it's there, and you're expecting it to be on-prem in 3 to 6 months, you might be waiting longer. The other thing is that the SharePoint framework is all about the new user interface experience. So on-prem, many SharePoint farms will not go to the new interface experience even when it's available, because it's going to be upsetting and a disruption to the users. So to me, Microsoft first of all has to make it available, with some type of a, whatever they're calling the new service packs now. And then secondly, what do you have to do, to your environment? And is the IT staff going to be willing? And do we have to make changes to the user interface experience that, just whoever's playing the SharePoint initiatives at a company, will say it's not worth it if we have to kind of change things over to the new UI to be able to use the, SharePoint framework. Once again, I'm just more of I want to see the bits, I want to test them and make sure they work, despite Microsoft saying it's going to be there, it's going to be available in the 3 to 6 month time frame. Okay, one more question here. Currently, the only way to use PBI and SPFx is with Power BI embedded. That is what I have found, short of creating SharePoint web parts that either use the Active Directory Authentication Library for JavaScript, and that has a well-known issue that it doesn't work in IE when your Office 365 SharePoint Online stuff is in a trusted site configuration. So ADL breaks. So people are going using things like hello.js, which is a different authentication library. But I figured I wouldn't write code if Microsoft's going to come back and in the framework itself, provide the plumbing, to be able to get other access tokens, rather than this. So I'm not going to say it's impossible. It's just you're going to use a technique, that might be obsolete, when the SharePoint framework finally ships. Okay, can Crystal reports be rendered in Power BI? No, they cannot. I see them as direct competitors inside there. So if you have data, I'm sure that you can find some ways to get to the same data and pull back, but pretty much, you have to work with Power BI Desktop and get to some data source, before you're going to make sense of working with it in Power BI. Okay, well, I thank you for all your questions. We will have the recording of this session up soon. Once again, congratulations to our contest winner, Maria. And other than that, I hope you found today's session useful. And we look forward to seeing you back for more webinars or critical path training in the future. Thanks again, everyone.